honest wage, paid for by people like you. I don't care what you say, I don't care what you do. No, 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 I don't care. No, no, I don't care. As you can see, I don't care. No, no, I'm not gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living. No, no, never gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living. I take home an honest wage, but paid for a people like you. I don't care what you say, I don't care what you do now. No, no, I don't care. No, no, I don't care. As you can see, I don't care. No, no, I'm not gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living. No, no, never gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living. I take home an honest wage, and I take it every day. Your idea of work is my idea of pay. No, no, I'm not gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living. No, no, never gonna give in. I'm an idiot for a living.
Okay, so welcome to the Old Abbey Tap House Radio. My name's John. I've got an arts background. I want to use this opportunity to explore a question I'm interested in, which is how do people who are working within an arts environment, how do they go about earning their living? So today I'm going to be speaking to a friend of mine who's not in Manchester, called Steph Pike. And I'm going to let Steph introduce herself. Over to you, Steph.
Great. Hello. Thanks, John. Hello. Yeah, as John said, my name's Steph Pike. I don't live in Manchester at the moment, but I lived in Manchester for 30 years, and that's where I start. I'm a poet. I'm a performance poet and a political activist. And Manchester is where I started my poetry journey and started performing, and where my heart still is, I think, in Manchester. But yeah, that's me really. Oh, just to say, I'm a performance poet, but I have had a pamphlet published and a collection of poetry published by Flapjack Press, a very brilliant small poetry press in Manchester.
Okay, that's good. Is it for people who can't see? Steph's on the left of the screen and she's got two megaphones on the right hand side of the screen.
Can you see that?
Is that related to your poetry or to your political activism?
Both, actually.
One for each.
Yeah. I actually did a kind of, with some friends, we did I obviously use the megaphones for political demonstrations, but we did once do in Manchester a kind of poetry, politics kind of protest stroke event where we stood in St Anne's Square shouting political poems through the megaphones. So yeah, they come in handy for both.
There's a blurring of the lines there. I think
Exactly.
that's something we'll probably talk about, isn't it? So my next question was, what is your arts environment? And it's poetry, I suppose.
Yes.
Is that, that summarise it? Is that everything, or?
Well, probably more to kind of clarify, but performance poetry is probably really my art form, because there is a sort of, although the distinctions are blurred, there's what people call page poetry, where people write poetry really to be published, sometimes to be read, but performance poetry is a slightly different form of poetry and is written specifically to be performed rather than just published or read, really.
Yeah. This is an interesting off-piste question, but if you write a piece of performance poetry, I assume it's with you in mind as the performer. What happens if someone else picks up that piece of work and performs it? How does that work?
Well, it's interesting. It does happen. It has happened. Not a lot, but it has happened, and it's interesting. It's an interesting experience because obviously other people perform it in a slightly different way with a slightly different emphasis or intonation. So yeah, it's an interesting.
Yeah, so it's an adjunct as opposed. You're not writing. You're writing it for performance, but for you to perform as well, aren't you?
Yeah. And I think most performance poets do that. They'll be writing for themselves to perform it rather than for other people.
From what you were saying, it's like a structured form of self-expression where you've got your ideas, you've organised them in the way that you think makes the most sense, and then it allows you to deliver them. You are part of that process.
Yeah.
All right.
Exactly.
When we talked about this, one of the first things you said to me was, "Yeah, but I don't earn a living from my poetry." As a sort, and I think what I said to you then and what I'll say now is I'm really interested in how people who are working in an arts environment get by. How do they earn a living in order to do what they do? So it's not, but having said that, do you charge? You said you've written a book, you obviously do stuff. Do you earn any money from it, or do you purely do it in order to do it?
I do earn some money from it occasionally, but not enough by any stretch of the imagination to live off. So, my books, you have to pay for the book. Some performances, you get paid. Workshops really are where you get paid the most, I would say, delivering poetry workshops, rather than performances. So yeah, there is some payment, but really, I think particularly in the poetry world, it's difficult to make a lot of money. Some people do it, which is fantastic, and I do think that where possible, poets should be paid, because it is, an art form, and people should be paid for their sort of time and their creativity. But having said that, it's a kind of funny situation, because on the one hand, I think that, but then on the other hand, I think where a lot of the interesting poetry is being written and performed is in these sort of areas where, the sort of underground areas, or the areas where people aren't being paid, which isn't to say people shouldn't be paid, but it's in the terms of, in this world, unfortunately, often, what's valued most is sort of fame or money, or how people decide what is valuable or what is good is whether people are being paid to do it, and whether they're famous, or whether they've sold a lot of books. And so, away from the question about whether people should be paid or not, I don't see things like that. I don't think anything's got any inherent value because it's, say, sort of commercially successful, or there's a lot of people who either aren't published or aren't paid or don't make their living through art, but are doing a lot of the very interesting work.
Yeah.
And perhaps don't get the recognition that maybe they should.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, and I'll say it. A lot of stuff's measured quantitatively, isn't it? The amount of money you get paid, the amount of popularity, likes you can get on Facebook, and quality, by any other measure doesn't get a look in.
Exactly.
So, how long have you been writing poetry for?
Well, I've been writing poetry since I was probably about 13 or 14.
Okay.
But I've been writing and performing poetry since I was 39. So there was a big gap between when I started writing and when I actually started performing. And that coincided.
Oh, go on.
I think because from when I was 13 and 14, I was kind of writing sporadically and in a very different style, I'd say, to the poetry I started writing in my late 30s and subsequently started performing. So I think there was a change in the sort of style of poetry I was writing, and which I think was a move to kind of what you might call more like page poetry to performance poetry.
What brought that about?
I'd say politics, but it's funny because I've been a political activist since I was 18. But I think probably my politics and my poetry didn't sort of coincide up till, for whatever reason, when I was 39, I started writing more explicitly about politics. And I think that's what then kind of, sort of brought about the change to a more sort of performance poetry style, and I started performing.
Yeah. So the style and the content, they're sort of inherently related. And
yes.
So previously the content was sort of fitting better on a page, but at a certain point, as the content changed, your method of delivery, if you like, developed.
Yeah, and got better. I think what I'd written up to that point really wasn't that good. It was kind of, I think it was more, I was trying to write like I thought poetry, or we'd been taught poetry should be. So it wasn't very good, because it was like I was trying to do something that I thought it should be, rather than it sort of really fitting with how I felt or how I was politically. And then somehow at the age of 39, I just completely changed how I was writing, and it worked a lot better, I think.
So method wise, does it sounds like, and I think I can relate to this, that by actually speaking something, that is a different process to writing something, and it allows. So, well, I'm speaking for me, I suppose, so I should own it.
Yeah.
By actually standing there and doing a lecture, my understanding becomes different to actually constructing the lecture.
Yeah.
And I suppose, and also getting feedback as to things that do work, don't work. Not necessarily explicit, but observing how people respond to what you're saying.
Yes.
And then adapting to that, and then the actual process of doing something feeds into the content and the delivery of it the next time. That's been my experience, but it sounds like you're touching on something similar.
Very similar, because the way I write, in terms of how I write since I've been 39, when I write a poem, I'll start by writing with a pen and paper, but then to develop the poem, I have to read it out loud. And I suppose that's because it's going to be a performance piece. And the process of reading it out loud is then how I'll edit and develop the poem. I couldn't do it in the same way just by writing.
Yeah.
You know, it has to be you know, that spoken, that reading out loud element is, for me, crucial in developing and editing a poem.
Yeah. And again, not really thought out question, but I suppose the rhythm of how you speak might be different to the rhythm of how you read something. And
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Okay, so I've not thought about it in those terms, but that kind of cadence is a factor that changes.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to drag myself back to my script of questions.
To your question.
Because I've gone out of order, but that's okay. What were your early influences? Because you said you started writing early on and made this change at 39. I suppose, what got you going along this route in the first place?
But when I was a teenager, well, I think the poets that influenced me at that time were people like Sylvia Plath, Emily Dickinson, and then a bit after that, in my late teens, Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich, Suniti Namjoshi. These were sort of poets that I think particularly influenced me and inspired me.
How did you encounter them?
I think Sylvia Plath, I think she was probably on the syllabus at school, literature syllabus. Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich and Suniti Namjoshi, those are all poets I encountered when I was at university, but not from because I studied literature at university, but not, they weren't people who were studied on the university courses, but they were poets I came across through being involved in political activism with feminism and socialism, and found out about through talking to other political people and women, and came across them that way. So I'd be reading all this stuff alongside my sort of, you know, university set reading lists and stuff. And
so the next thing on my list is poetry and politics.
Poetry and politics.
And we have sort of touched on it, but it's interesting for me because the previous two interviews I've done, we've not really ventured into the realm of politics. But I actually met you through the realm of politics.
Exactly.
So this is, you know, it's something that we can talk about.
Yeah, you know, exactly.
So
and it's our passion.
And they're tied together, aren't they, for you? Poetry
totally
and
tied. Totally tied together.
You said it seemed to become more clear to you at 39 that actually politics, poetry, and therefore performance of politics and poetry come together. So So what's the motivation for? I suppose what I've got in mind when I open my mouth there is it anger currently that motivates you, or is this something else? I mean, is it what is it in relation to I suppose it's wanting to write a poem about something?
Yeah, I suppose it is anger. It's anger at the system that exists and the injustices that exist today. But I suppose it's not just anger, it's like passion and love as well for people and the world, and, you know, wanting to create a better world. So I think it's a mixture of all those that kind of spur me to, you know, both in the same for both politics and poetry. You know, for me, they're kind of inextricably linked now, the politics and the poetry.
I was when we were talking earlier about earning a living, and you mentioned a couple of things that probably doing poetry workshops is the most stable, direct way of making money out of poetry. Would doing the performances and writing the books be like in academia? If you've written a paper, you do talks at conferences to alert people to the fact that you have written a paper. So would doing the performances and writing the books give you the platform in order to run workshops that bring people in, or is it the other way around?
I think it's that way round. I think you kind of, all the workshops I've done is because have been as a result of the performances I've done and the poems that have been published, or so it's definitely that way round. I think it's kind of, you know, people will ask you to do a workshop if they have seen that you're, you know, a poet that they like or think is quite good. Although that's interesting, because that wouldn't necessarily mean you're good at running a workshop, interestingly enough. But, you know, they're different things really. But yeah, it's definitely, I think it'd be very hard to get work as running a poetry workshop if you hadn't sort of established yourself in some way as a poet.
And the running being a performance poet, I imagine, allows you to connect with a lot more people than being a page poet, because
definitely,
inevitably you're at an event and people are at that event and you perform. People are exposed to it, they respond to it or not. So I suppose that the aspect of being a performance poet feeds into that idea of then connecting with people and doing subsequent related activities.
I mean, I've done, you know, it's led to sort of other opportunities. Like like I said, I've delivered poetry workshops, I've spoken at conferences, I've, you know, been part of a academic conference on the legacy of the suffragettes, and so it does, you know, it does kind of open other interesting related doors, if you like. And like you say, page poets, I know, obviously, unless the page poets are very famous, but for page poets who maybe aren't so famous, they actually sell less books or pamphlets than performance poets, because one of the things performance poets can do, as well as, you know, be heard by a lot more people, because, you know, very few people are going to sort of buy copies of poetry books by poets they haven't heard of. But like you say, as a performance poet, you can, you know, you're performing to the audience that comes to that event, and not all events are just purely poetry events. So I've performed at, say, music events that have asked some poets to perform, so you're getting to a new audience, an audience who haven't necessarily come there to hear poetry, but then hear it because it's on at the same event and like it, or, you know, conferences. So you'll get, you know, you can get to a whole audience that hasn't come specifically to hear poetry, which is useful. And then often, you know, people will buy your book because they've just heard you perform. And although I'm not very good at saying I've got a book, I'm terrible at promoting that at concerts. It's embarrassing, but, you know, it is a way of being able to sell your book because you're there in front of an audience. And
that's an interesting comment, you know, because when I spoke to my friend Mike, who's a singer-songwriter, he said he found it really difficult to promote his own stuff. And you know, to say I'm really proud to present, you know, my latest offering, just didn't feel very comfortable at all. But it sounds like you feel comfortable writing the stuff, getting out there and
Yeah.
delivering it. But then when it comes to commodifying it in a more
it's
direct, you know,
excruciating. It's
commercial
horrible.
way.
Yeah.
I wonder what, because that's probably a really interesting nugget, isn't it? Because a lot of people who work in the arts, you know, they put their heart and soul into stuff, but then when it comes to that idea of commercializing it, it feels awkward.
It does. It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, it's a very funny thing.
And it might, you know,
And even worse.
Oh, sorry, go on.
Even if you know, like, you can do gigs and expect to be paid and feel completely fine about being paid, but then when it comes to sort of advertising or selling your own book, it's awful.
So, so I'm going to make you tell us what your book is at the end. So, next question. It's another off-piste question, but what's your, you know, can you give us an idea of one of the highlights of your poetry career to date? Personal thing that you feel really
personal highlights.
value.
I think having my book published was one of the highlights. My first collection.
How many books have you had published?
I've had a pamphlet published by the Knives, Forks and Spoon Press, which are a fantastic press based in the north. So that was very, very exciting. And then it was very exciting having my first full collection published by Flapjack Press in Manchester. That was really a wonderful thing. It was about 3 or 4 years ago. Okay,
so it's so the highlight was having publication page poetry.
Yeah, one of them was, I know.
So
very interesting.
What about that experience of actually the performers getting up on stage and you've got an audience?
I mean, there have been many highlights. One of them was performing for the JC for PM, one of the big JC for PM concerts in Manchester and in Leeds. That they were particularly exciting. One was performing on the same stage as Toyah Willcox in Manchester.
Wow, when was that?
That was about 4 or 5 years ago, and she performed in what's that place called? Tribeca.
Oh, I don't know that.
Yeah, it's in the Village in Manchester.
Okay.
And she performed there, and I was one of the warm-up poets. And I loved Toyah, so it was just brilliant. She was amazing. It was an amazing gig. It was like I was on the same I was on the poster with her, and I got to meet her. So that was particularly exciting as well.
Oh,
and getting to, and one of the other I mean, these are different highlights, but one of the other highlights was I was part of this. This is about 6 or 7 years ago. Part of a project, a library project. I had a poem chosen to be made into postcards and posters and put into libraries across the Northwest. And as part of it, we were invited to deliver poetry workshops. And so I did one at Sefton. And for the next 3 or 4, 5 years, they invited me back to do a poetry workshop and then a poetry slam that they hosted. And it was local people from Crosby, at Crosby Library. And it was just one of those brilliant, I love doing it. It was just like one of my favorite things every year, because people from the local community would, they'd come and perform a poem and they'd never read a poem or performed a poem in public before. And it was just a really beautiful, beautiful experience. And the staff at the library were brilliant and so lovely and so enthusiastic about promoting poetry. It was just amazing.
Yeah, so highlights come in many different forms, don't they?
Yes.
So we have touched on it, but you don't earn your living, or you don't support yourself through your poetry, do
Not at
you?
all.
And at any point have you considered going down the route of trying to support yourself through your poetry, or has it always been the acknowledgement that this is my poems, this is what I do for a job?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much always been like that. I don't really think I've ever seriously considered trying to make a living out of it, because I suppose I've just thought it's felt impossible, and also I've been ambivalent about whether I'd want to do that, because I mean, I'm not the most prolific writer. You know, some people have the ability to write lots of really good poems in short periods of time, and I just, for whatever reason, can't do that.
Yeah.
So I think I'd be rubbish at being a professional poet, unless I was paid £40,000 for one poem, which is like impossible. And also, I thought as well, if it started feeling like a chore, which it might do if I had to make a living out of it,
Yeah.
I might not enjoy it anymore, and I wouldn't want that to happen.
Yeah. So the flip side of, oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, and I think also to do that, you would have to kind of really teach a lot of poetry workshops, and I'm not sure that's what I'd want to do. And I suppose because my politics is so intertwined with my poetry, I'd be worried about having to make compromises if I had to make a living out of it.
Yeah, that's what was coming across, and this is a sort of parallel discussion to the one I had with Mike. Is that it gives you an enormous amount of freedom, not having to rely on your particular art or your particular practice to earn a living. You can pick and choose, and you can have that range of highlights that can be more or less profitable in the commercial sense, but incredibly meaningful to you.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in a way, your poetry career is very much about you expressing your ideas and connecting with people and places and organisations who respond to that. In creating I suppose it's a parallel, but within your work, within your actual paid work. Does that feed in, or is it simply separate, or are they overlaps, or how does that work?
No, I think they do overlap, and I'm very lucky in that sense that I have a job that I really like, so that makes it easier not to have to make.
What's your job?
I'm a welfare benefits advisor, so essentially for people who are on universal credit or other welfare benefits who refused it, I help people appeal against decisions. So advise people about how to get their benefits, and sort out problems with their benefits or get benefits reinstated. So in that sense, I see it as a highly political job.
Yeah.
And I think
you're also politically active beyond your job, aren't you?
Yep, definitely. And I think I think the activism in my job kind of influences my poetry, but also I see my poetry as part of my political activism. They're kind of inseparable in a way.
Yeah, there's a quote, and you may know it better than me. Activism's the rent I pay for being alive, something like that.
Right. No, I didn't know that, and that's a good one. And I wrote a quote down as well, which is a quote by Tony Kade Bambara, who was she was a Black civil rights activist in America. And she said, the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and I think that kind of sums up
Yeah.
the role of poetry for me, or yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And I saw that in a window of a community centre, and I just thought, oh my God, that absolutely sums up what poetry is for me, and what art is for me.
Yeah, when I was talking to someone else, Tony, he was saying he hasn't quite worked out what are the phrases that describes what he does.
Right.
But it sounds like you found exactly.
I found it. Yeah, I didn't have to make it one up. I found it, the perfect
Fantastic.
one. So,
so the next question, I'm sort of on track. You've been away a lot, haven't you, recently?
yes,
So I was wondering, I did ask you about it, and you,
yeah.
but the question is, has that fed into your poetry at all yet? Your experiences being away for a period of time?
Well, I think it's too early to tell. I mean, the strange thing is, before I went traveling, because I went traveling for just over a year, I thought, brilliant, I'll have all this time, I'll write loads of poetry, it'll be really good. I didn't write a single poem. It was totally the opposite to what I expected it would be. And I've sort of been thinking about it since I got back, and I think I did write a travel journal, which I was very inconsistent about writing. So there's huge gaps where I didn't, and then long periods when I did. So I think I was doing that, and I think it made me think maybe this is why I write poetry, because the problem with me writing the journal was, and why I kind of didn't do it all the time, was because when I started writing about a day, rather than writing 3 or 4 sentences, I was writing 3 or 4 pages. So I was like, oh my God, why can't I be succinct about this? I'm just writing and writing and writing. And maybe that's why I write poetry, because without the kind of constraints of poetry, I'd never bleeding stop. So, but I think as well with traveling, you know, I don't think I'd anticipated how time consuming traveling was in terms of mental headspace. And I mean, it was absolutely the most amazing experience, but at times it was really stressful. And I think as well, when, you know, I need time to write, so I need a lot of time to just sit and almost daydream, and, you know, I think of things I've written and go over it in my head. And actually, when you're traveling, you don't get that much time or headspace. You know, it's, you know, and when you're somewhere in the world, you kind of think, I'm here. I can't just sit in a room thinking about, you know, the clouds or images or whatever. I've got to be out and exploring where I am. So actually, you don't get all the time you think you would. So interestingly, although I did write a travel diary, but I didn't write any poetry. So, and I've, you know, started writing poetry again since I've got back, but nothing that I can see. I suppose it's been overtaken by the coronavirus. So, you know, that's kind of figuring a lot in it. But I think the traveling, I think that will start influencing and coming into my poetry sort of in the future, in the near future.
Yeah, because a lot of the places you visited had a political aspect to how you engaged with the place, didn't they?
Yeah, no, totally. And it was really interesting. And we met people on our travels who were political. You know, for example, we went to a little island off Okinawa, which is an archipelago right in the south of Japan, off the main island of Japan. It's actually nearer Taiwan than it is to mainland Japan. And we just happened to go to this cafe a couple of days and got talking to the man and woman who owned it, and they were really involved with the peace movement there, because Okinawa, about a third of the island is USA bases
Yeah, yeah,
that the local population don't want there. So there's a massive anti-war peace movement and a campaign to get the USA bases off the island. So we met them, and that was really interesting. We just happened to mention about, oh God, the army bases, and then they told us they were part of the peace movement. And so, and there were lots of examples like that where we sort of met people and found out about the politics. It was really fascinating.
there's an interesting phrase there where anti-war, and then you went on to the peace movement, and I think
Yeah,
one's a reactionary stance, isn't it, and the other one is more
yeah,
positive, and
yeah,
it sort of reminded me of what you were saying about your poetry as being the sort of to make the change beautiful, you know, to remind people that it's not, we're not always trying to resist this horrible stuff, but
yeah,
actually we can turn around and there's a brighter future.
yeah. It is.
And I
You're
suppose
right. It's about,
words are really important in reminding us that, aren't they?
yeah, because you're right. It's about creating something. Ultimately, it's about, in all our sort of, like you say, anti-war or anti-government or anti-pollution, and the anger that comes with that. Essentially, what we're trying to do is create something beautiful at the end of the day, and that's really what our politics are about, I think.
Yeah, and in a way you can't necessarily expect to get paid for doing that kind of work, can you?
No, and I think I suppose it's no, and exactly, because it's about being part of a movement, not being paid to do something. And like I said before, in this world, unfortunately, as soon as you're paid, you're to some degree or other compromised.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say that that's a bad thing sometimes, but in terms of, you know, your art as a political tool, it's not really going to work.
Yeah. So if you were working for a big multinational, you'd probably be in the blue sky thinking department. But you're an unpaid director of the, the left of centre blue sky thinking department.
My
So I've worked out your title.
Thanks, John. That's a very snappy title.
So nearing the end of our interview,
Yep.
thinking about if someone was at the other end of the journey and they were thinking about what they want to do, and poetry is important to them.
Yeah.
Have you got any, you know, if you look back on your career, have you got any sort of things you would say to them?
What I'd say is, particularly if it's performance poetry, go to lots of poetry nights. They're great for not just hearing other poets and what's, you know, the poetry scene's like, also meeting other poets. I mean, I think being in a community of poets, particularly like-minded poets, is invaluable, really. You know, we kind of, I think we often have an image of a writer or a poet, you know, in a lonely room, you know, writing away on their own. And that's certainly a part of it. But like all ideas and everything, I think everything is communal in that our ideas and the images we use and the phrases we use are formed by the community around us. And in a sense, poetry is about coming up with something original, but not original in the sense of I've literally thought it up on my own without any influence from anyone else, because we're all influenced by everything around us. We're influenced by the past, we're influenced by the writers that have come before us, we're influenced by the writers that exist today, and so we should be. And you know, get involved with, you know, life is your material. You know, if you sit on your own, you're not really going to get any material in terms of ideas or images or words or phrases to write really good poetry. It is a communal pursuit, I think, in terms of, you know, even the ideas that you're trying to convey in your poems, you get those ideas, they are formed by the people around you and the events around you and the situations around you, and the only way really to get those is to be involved in something and amongst other people. So yeah, immerse yourself in poetry, get to know other poets, read other poetry, get involved in something you're passionate about. And you know, sometimes it can be hard work. It's, you know, as we all know, it's not, a poem doesn't just come to you in a flash of inspiration. It's a bit of a hard slog sometimes, which be a bit of a pain of the arse in the arse, but you know, just keep going and talk to other people and be involved.
I wasn't going to ask you any more questions. However, when you made a really interesting comment there about we want to be original. And I suppose what I immediately thought when you said that is how perhaps what is original and what is our role within the process? Because on the one hand, we want to create something, and original might be one way of describing it. What you're saying is immerse yourself with other people who are doing stuff, create the environment that's going to help nurture it. So I suppose what I'm trying to working out is that perhaps we as the individual are the original ingredient in our work, and the things that and therefore we choose what to select to put into our work.
Exactly.
So in a way, what you describe is nurturing yourself in order to, rather than searching for an original subject, by immersing ourselves and situating ourselves, that's how these things are created.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, what I always find amazing about music and art and novels and poetry, you know, and I say this sometimes to people in workshops, is what I find so fascinating and amazing about it is, you know, how many hundreds of thousands of years human beings have been alive and writing and thinking, and still people are writing sentences or poems that no one's ever written before, whether they're good or bad or indifferent. You know, they've never been written in that way before, and I find that absolutely incredible and exciting. John, I'm going to have to go now because Claire's got to teach.
That's fine. Just remind us, or send us a link to your book, and I'll put it I'll type it into the link on the website.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Steph, thanks very much.
It's been an absolute pleasure, John, and lovely to see your face.
Likewise. All right.
All right. Give my love to Karen and the girls.
Hello to Claire.
Okay.
All right. See you later.
Okay. Take care. Thanks, John.
Bye.
Bye. This is a new poem. It's a form of poem called a hainaku, which is a bit like a haiku. Each verse has 3 lines, and the first line has 1 word in it, the second line has 2 words, and the third line has 3 words. We are not your fucking herd. Ward
last breath surrounded by plastic. Our memory is collective and persistent. Promise, a plague on this government.